I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I am here with CJ Leede, the author of American Rapture. There's a good chance you also know her as the author of Mave Fly, which was a huge hit last year, or was it 2 years ago?
June 6/6/23.
23. All
Yeah.
right. Now, that was I've talked about this before many times, but Chad Stroup and Brian Asman, like the first time I ever heard about this book, Mave Fly, was them like spending literally more than an hour straight talking about how incredible it was. So, and I kept telling them that they were overhyping it to whatever, and it was great anyways. So but here with American Rapture, we have a book that is completely 100% up my alley. This is a weird apocalypse novel, and anyone who's listened to my podcast knows my absolute favorite subgenre of horror fiction is the weird apocalypse. So, like, this book was kind of engineered for me in many ways. So,
I wrote it just for you, actually. So
right. And I know, CJ, that you're also a dog rescue person. And so I would just want to warn you that I have a very loud dog at my feet right now. So if people start walking by outside, we might hear from Pika. So
I love that. That just makes me feel at home. I've got one on my lap here.
yeah. Well, I just really appreciate that part of your story, since that is a huge part of what I do over here too. So, CJ, let's get into your horror origin. How did we end up here with you writing horror fiction? Where did you discover the genre, and have you always been a reader?
Always been a reader forever. I was an only child who like very much grew up with like dogs as my siblings and books around me. So that was like my whole childhood, dogs and
Mhm.
books. And then I kind of stumbled into writing through like a kind of bizarre series of events in my early 20s and ended up really kind of like getting the bug for it. And I tried to send some books out for a lot of years, nothing happened, and I ended up going back to school for it, which I always say like nobody needs grad school to be a writer or any school to be a writer at all, but it was the path I took. Um, and when I was in grad school, I was handing in stories and my professor was like, "Hey, I think these are horror stories." And I was like,
Mhm.
"No, there's no way. Like I don't read horror. I don't like I was like one of those people like I don't do that stuff." And he was like, I think you should like read some horror novels just to see." And I read my first Stephen King. I was 24 and I was like, "Oh shit, this is it. This is what I want to do." And then I like subsequently went down the biggest like Stephen King rabbit hole and then like Joe Hill and then like everyone else. It was like the floodgates opened and ever
Mhm.
since I've just been like reading as much as I can and it's like a fucking wonderland, you know?
Well, and which is cool too, because you get to experience it as a fully formed adult and somebody who can understand a lot of us who started reading when we were really young didn't get all the I read The Shining when I was in eighth grade, but I didn't understand all the family dynamics, for example, because I
Yeah.
was too young to get it.
Or like the anxiety of being like a writer, you know, like he's got a few
Yeah.
books like that of like what is it to be like an unpredictable chaotic creator, you know, and like how does that affect the people around you? Like it's amazing.
Yeah, and well, and I think too that one of the other things too, when you're already like learning the craft and you're starting to read it, is then you get to read for craft from the very beginning of horror fiction, and you know, and that's great. Because I will say, however, though, it was, I mean, one of the reasons why I am the way that I am is that for me, it was Stephen King's The Raft, the short story The Raft. When I was a kid, when I was like eighth grade, I was like, oh, I see what he's doing. I see how he's engineering this. And, you know, then I kind of like understood what was happening. So you kind of answered one of my next questions, which is why horror, and it was that teacher that kind of, you know, put you on that path. Do you remember which Stephen King you read first?
It was, well, it was the teacher, but it was like, I guess I was already writing it. And I would say the answer is like, I'm just afraid of a lot. So those are kind of the stories I feel like I have.
Mhm.
The first, well, I remember the first two, but I can't remember which was first. And it was The Shining and Misery. And they're
Right.
both just like the greatest books ever.
Yeah, yeah, those are two of the top notch King, for sure. Well, and it's cool that you were already kind of like in that realm. Do you remember, you know, what was the theme or the story that kind of hooked your professor? That what was the concept that they were that he or
I mean,
she, I didn't catch that. Who you know, what was it that they caught in of horror in the story?
well, I had at that point, I mean, it was like end of first semester, so I had handed in many. And he was like,
Okay.
every one of these is like a horror story. You know, like one, I don't know, I knew like one was vampires and one was like, you know, I did like kind of a dark sci-fi thing. And I kind of thought, I don't know, I just always thought maybe I would write like sci-fi fantasy, or I was in a lit program and I was kind of trying my hand at that. And I thought that's what I was doing. And he's like, no, every one of these seems like a horror story
Right.
in different ways.
Well, and I just my last interview was Brian Asman, and I had to pretend I didn't know some of these answers, but this time I don't know these answers for you. Where did you grow up? And because I'm always interested in the geography of where people grew up and how it influences them as artists.
Yeah, totally. And I think it really has. So I was actually born here in California, moved to Texas when I was like 3. And
Hmm.
then I stayed there until high school. And I went to high school outside of Boston. And then I finished high school in Manhattan. And I stayed in Manhattan for like 10 years, other than a year of travel.
Hmm.
Um, and then I moved here.
Well,
So
and
yeah, I've got like one parent in Texas and one up on the East Coast.
and it's interesting too because you said, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we'll have to come back to Wisconsin and how like Wisconsin ended up such a huge part of this book. But before we get into that, I want to like I one thing I did know, I didn't do a ton of research because I try to come into these a little more blank, but I know that American Rapture, most of it was written before Mave Fly, if I'm correct, right? Like,
Yeah, well, it's kind of hard to say like most of it because that book, American Rapture, I first started working on it in 2013, and the draft I wrote of it then was so bad and so different from what it currently is. And I think I went through maybe like 12 or 14 like blank page draft iterations of it, and then like many edits obviously within those. And we're talking like over a 10-year period. So it was like I had this one idea and I knew I wanted to tell this story and I knew what it was going to be fundamentally about, but I just didn't know enough about storytelling. I also didn't really know enough about like being a human. Like I think I had to mature to be able to write it the right way. And I almost feel now that I had to write Maeve and like clear myself of that kind of like very bodily um you know, rage and all of those things that I was kind of dealing with at that time. And I got that out of my system, and then it kind of like freed me up to make American Rapture what it really needed to be from a more adult standpoint. And I
hmm.
think, but yeah, it's like it's been a journey. It really
Yeah,
took a long time and kind of took a village, a lot of people weighing in and saying, nah, I think maybe we need to kind of change the shape here. Or maybe it's more about, like we need to pull this thread through more. And then we finally got there.
yeah. I one time my novel Punk Rock Ghost Story. I wrote the entire thing and started from page zero again and never looked at the first draft ever again. Um, Almost 5 years later. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and partially because I had some experiences, some things I learned a bunch, whatever. But and it was funny too because my editor at the time at Deadite, when I sold him on the concept, I had told him I need 7 years to do this book, and he was like, "What?" And because I was Blair Witching the promotion of it, and I was trying to convince people that the band and it was real, and that time allowed me to go, "Oh, I'm a way better writer. I can do this." So I'm wondering if you had a similar situation where you're just like with American Rapture, like I had the idea then, but I wasn't the writer that I am now. And I'm sure everything you did on Mave fueled that belief that you could do a better version of it, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I also think like it just wasn't the right time. Like sometimes it's not the right time to put something into the world. Sometimes, like this when I first started sending this out, like a woman writing the stuff that I'm writing, like it totally existed, but it didn't exist in the places I was trying to sell it. And so I think like it's a new world with horror. Like I think everyone is, especially folks who've been here a long time, like really getting the respect that they've always deserved and or at least starting to. And I think it's a very cool time and I feel very like incredibly grateful to get to be a part of it now because I meet some of the most accomplished writers ever and they're like, yeah, I've been doing this forever and like, I couldn't get like mainstream readers until the last couple of years. So it's just I'm really thrilled that it's happening and yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know. I got lucky.
Well, and it's funny for those of us who have been doing it a long time. I think it's hard to resist a little bit of jealousy when you see somebody come right out of the gates and they're kicking butt, but you always have to acknowledge that it's because their work is connecting and they've done the hard work, and and you know that connection is something that is chemical. It's magic, almost like when an author finds a readership, when people like connect with the work, that psychic connection between the creator sitting at the keyboard and the reader reading the book. You can't manufacture it. Sometimes you can't make it happen. It happens. It's magic.
Yeah, and to be fair, like I mean, I was sending this book out since 2013 or
Right.
2014. So it was like I think there were probably like 7 years of no's on I wrote 3 books. So there's another one I wrote too that has not seen the light of day and I don't really know if it will. I hope it does one day. It's a vampire trucker book. Um
I'm already sold.
but it's crazy like I got so lucky because when it did happen it just happened like in the way that it did, but for so long, man, it was like that thing where you dread going to family gatherings because like I would just think, oh my god, if one person asks me about my fucking career and if I have to answer like no, I've had another year of no's, like it's just brutal.
Right.
So uh
Well, and most writers who look like overnight successes have years of being in the trenches and fighting, and those of us who do it realize that. you know um but you know eventually Mave Fly is the one that sells
yeah.
and gets out there, and I'm kind of joking about the hype with Chad and Brian, and it was partially because for me the joke was is that like I was just like they kept talking about this book and they kept talking about it, and I was like, come on guys, can it really be that good? So tell me, Mayfly, it is like it's a book that a lot of people are talking we're talking about, and it's hard to kind of quantify like what is viral in a book, but the types of conversations that people were having about this book, for something that's a pretty transgressive story, there's a lot of conversations happening about it. Were you surprised at how wide the discussions of the book of that particular book were?
I mean, for sure. I think well, one, I want to say those guys, like, it's mutual admiration club with them. So I'm a big fan of theirs too. But in terms of like, yeah, when you've gotten no's for so long, like, you don't expect anything, or at least I didn't. And
Mm,
I couldn't get an agent forever. Mave, one agent said yes, and he ended up being the greatest possible person I ever could have worked with. But it was like one. And with Mave, like, we got him, and then we got to the stage of selling it, and so many editors were just like, I don't know, it's not, could we turn it into a thriller? Or, like, one editor was like, loved it, but then she was like, my higher ups just said no, just flat out. They were like, absolutely not. And like, it was
right.
interesting. Like, we felt that from the get go, that it was like, this book was getting really kind of strong reactions, and some of them were very negative. And
Mhm.
luckily, like, I found an editor who was willing to take a chance on it, and she's been incredible. The whole team has. But we knew from day one, and she even told me, she said, this book is going to be very polarizing, and we all kind of knew, like, we need a brace for that. And that's what it's been. And so
Yeah.
it's funny because it's like the readers of Mave, you have readers who are like, thank you for doing this, like, representing the weird girls. And you have readers who are like, this is super extreme. And you have readers who are like, it's not extreme at all. And this is like try hard and like girly horror. And then you have readers who are like, I don't know, like, I don't want to eat scrambled eggs anymore. Or like, why did, this is cruel, or it's too feminist, or it's anti-feminist, or I don't, it's like, it was just such a weird thing where like there was so much reaction. And I can't look at like Mave reviews, for example, because they're just so like, they're so intense and so like uh fervent, but all over the place.
Right. Well, and it's funny because some people, I don't know how you are about this, but um uh for me, like one of my main fields of study is Philip K. Dick, right? And this author, and one of my like the workshop I'm teaching at BizarroCon is about the Philip K. Dick novel formula. And one time, one of Phil's very good friends, the World Fantasy Award winning author, like when my workshop was being previewed on an online class, he called it bullshit, and everyone like froze, like thinking I was going to be super offended. I was like, "Oh, it's great! His friend called it bullshit," and I was like, "I get to prove him wrong, or I get to fight for it." And I'm wondering if some of the controversy with Mave Fly was exactly what you were looking for. Like you had to have enjoyed some of that. I mean, writing a transgressive book like that, right?
I guess so. I mean, I have to say, like, I didn't like set out to write. I wasn't like, oh, I really want to write something like transgressive or like subversive.
Mm,
Like, I just thought, what, like, I was honestly in a really dark, weird headspace when I wrote Mave. It was COVID. I had lost family members. It was pre that election.
yeah.
Um, and I drive across the country a lot, and I was driving across the country, and I was feeling just like such like vitriol everywhere, and I was feeling so
Mm-hmm.
powerless and getting all the rejections for so many years. And I got fixated on this idea of rewriting Story of the Eye. That's where it all started. I was getting so sick of Lit World being like, so here's the deal. Like, it's always been, for a long time, it was only male writers who got the stage. But I feel very strongly that we should never discard good writing. It's just everyone else should now also have a seat at the table, is my opinion. And
Mhm.
so I was seeing people be like, well, you like don't read something like American Psycho, or don't read something like Story of the Eye, or don't read something like Notes from Underground. And I'm like, why? They're incredible, you know?
Mhm.
And instead of don't read them, I thought, well, what if I get to celebrate them, but also see a woman in them and just see what that looks like, and see like, I wanted to see myself in those kind of like fictional crazy characters. And for me it was just very cathartic and kind of a release. And um yeah, I don't know. I wasn't trying to be like, oh man, it'll be so fun to like be so controversial. It just like that was kind of the story I had in me. And but
Well, and,
yeah,
and I
it's been a whole thing.
one thing I appreciate about your work is that you seem to want to express a certain amount of rage at everything, and that, like, I'm all for it. In the last 2 days, I'm one of the people that keeps telling people stop looking for silver linings, or like you know like be real about this, right? And I think, and I should state for anyone far in the future who might be watching this, we were recording this 2 days after the election. So and I think American Rapture is every bit as much of of a rage book as Mave Fly, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I to me, like Maeve is really a
That's a
book about.
positive, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I think Maeve is like really a book about like anticipatory grief and getting in your own way. And like Maeve is a very like self-involved character, and she's so kind of tied up in her rage that she can't see that there might be paths forward in her life. And American Rapture to me is actually like I hoped for it to be actually ultimately a very hopeful book, because I think I was just trying to say with it, like I think we have these issues, and I think we spend all this time looking at these things that aren't serving us and are actually like really maybe very damaging, and systemically and individually. But if we rid ourselves of them, or if we even try, can you imagine how great the path forward would be? And I
Right.
think that's what I was trying to say with this book, is just like we don't need to carry this shit that isn't serving us, and maybe we can find, like new ways to exist that don't involve them.
Well, and this is going to have to happen in spoilers, but one of the things that I do want to drill into is that, there's a lot of talk about Mayfly being this great feminist novel, and but for me, like, American Rapture is every bit as much of a feminist novel, and in some ways it expressed a particular thing that, in my experience of watching my wife go through the world, was something that was very meaningful to me. And we'll get back to that in spoilers. But so this book, now, from my perspective, I was raised non-religiously by a Jewish father, and so I'm not a part of the Catholic thing, but it felt to me like this novel was kind of like a response to all, like, the sexual repression and things that are kind of inherent in growing up Catholic. And I don't, want to presume that, but that's what it seems like with this book, from the outside, anyways. But
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely with growing up Catholic, but also I just think kind of growing up in America. I mean, like we kind of like are such a, we were a puritanically founded country, and I think there is such a pervasive culture of teaching like young women that, like their whole value is their sexual selves, but it's also their greatest sin and shame, and they have to like regulate it so as not to incite like some kind of response in the opposite sex, or like even have who hasn't heard somebody say, well, like what was she wearing when that thing happened to her, or like, you
right.
know it's like this sort of blame situation that happens on a young person for just like literally existing. Um, so I think that, like, to me, it's like I always talk about, it's like those two billboards, like the lust drags you down to hell, and then like the triple X store, this exit. Like we see that everywhere, right? Like that is
Yeah.
America, is like those two things. And it's an impossible situation to grow up in, to be like, I want to be beautiful. I want to be, I imagine now it's like a fucking TikTok sensation. Who knows? But like I want to be wanted, but at the same time, I'm so afraid of this like vessel that my mind is in. And I think it's like that's not going to not affect you. And I think it's probably not only young women. I imagine it's all types of young folks. It's just that's obviously the experience I'm coming from. And I
Mm.
think the same thing with like feminist novel. Like I really appreciate that. Like I feel that I am very much a feminist, and I am also out here writing novels. But I think I am really just trying to say, like sin and shame and guilt are not helpful to us. And especially with this book, like I just think we're human animals. We're going to feel desire. And there are ways that we can uncomplicate things and just say, like, if you're loving, kind, if things are consensual, if like, then we don't need to regulate any other part of that. It can look however it looks. And I think, especially now, it's just like that mattered to me, to say, like, we're spending all our precious time as mortal beings who are gonna die and are gonna lose the ones we love. Sorry to be like dark about it.
No,
um
no, and what I think too is fascinating about you know the the lust pandemic part of this, and like I said, I'm a weird apocalypse person, but it because I think the fundamentals of storytelling are parallels and reversals, and so anyone who listens to my podcast regularly is groaning now because I always bring up parallels and reversals. I just did it with Brian Asman, but the reversal in this one and the parallels both are a part of that whole lust pandemic, which is like extroverting the repression, the what you were talking about with sin and how that's taught religiously in a puritanical country, right?
and yeah, really, and religiously and just culturally. And I think, like, it's that kind of externalization of, like, that's kind of what it feels like to be a young person. Like, you suddenly one day go into the world and you're like, oh my god, everything is about this one thing. And
Yeah.
it feels like an onslaught, and it's like no one gives you the tools to know how to navigate it, because like our teachers try, our parents might try, but it's just we don't quite talk about it in a way that I think is useful to young people, and is like does kind of strip it of any feeling of like, is there something wrong with me? Is there going to be a consequence for having had that one thought, looking at that one person, or whatever?
Yeah, well, and I will say what you're bringing up. I mean, with the young people, like Sophie, that's why Sophie's such an important character of the book. And yes, she's the and here's another thing too, is that another thing I bring up all the time is that I'm not a huge fan of first person narratives, and I always kind of complain
Which
about it.
is
And
all I do.
well, what's funny is that in my review I talked about how, like, I know when a good writer, because I'll if I forget that it's first person, if I just kind of like go with the novel, then I know that it's a good writer, because my biggest problem with first person is a lot of people cheat on it. Like they don't, you know, they bring in unrealistic things that wouldn't have to do with the narrative. But Sophie, it's important that it's first person with Sophie, and from her perspective is very important in the book, because we really have to be very close to her, right? Because you're expressing a lot of the novels expressing the fears that she doesn't fully understand, but you do as the adult writing the book, right? And that level of it works really, really well, and is very important. So, can you tell me about Sophie and like how important she was to this? Because I think in a very character-driven apocalypse novel like this, she's a lot. She's doing a lot of that heavy lifting.
Thank you. I think I felt with Sophie, like the main thing was, so she's very sheltered, and I knew she was going to have to be incredibly naive, going into the world. But I don't always love, like, I didn't want her to be helpless. Like, who wants to root for like a helpless person? So, or, a helpless person who's not like pulling their weight. And so I thought, okay, so I know she's going to be smart. I know she's going to be a reader. I know she's going to be curious. And I know she's going to have to be resourceful. But what does that look like when you are so sheltered? And then that's when I kind of came to the how to's. She reads her how to books. She has some kind of knowledge there, but she's also somebody who asks a lot of questions. And that's
Hmm.
a tricky thing to be as a young person sometimes, certainly in like a religious setting, because, often your questions are met with like, well, it's because it's what's in the book. And then you say, but why? Or, you try to get through deeper into it. And like you're often just met with because it's what's in the book. And,
Yeah.
it's just, I don't know. I think I wanted her to ask all the questions that I kind of found myself asking as a young person, but honestly, like even as an adult. And some of these things, like, really maybe haven't even left me all the way now. And I think I just wanted her to be someone we could root for, even though she was really struggling with things, even though she really was, in many ways, like she's like a privileged person. Like she grew up in a nice house. She had parents, she had a brother, but it's like, it's just everything else was very lonely and very isolating. And, trying to kind of explain what that isolation is, but still allow her the space to meet new people and go, oh, wow, that exists. And I want to understand that. And I might misstep when I meet somebody new because I don't know how to interact with somebody different from me. But what can I learn from that? And do I want to be like them? And I think that's also one of the joys of kind of growing up, is asking yourself those questions in your kind of late teen, early 20s years.
Sure. And one last question before we get into spoilers. I there's a Facebook group on Facebook for it's a science fiction book club. It's one of the most popular science fiction Facebook groups, and they are very anti-horror, and they try very hard to suppress crossover books. And I fought very hard to get them to let me post my review of American Rapture. I had to write very long to the moderators. I wrote this very long post about how the Lost Pandemic is social science fiction, how this book is absolutely 100% science fiction. And I was able to get it through, but it was funny how much I had to fight for this. Do you think of this book as science fiction, or do you find it funny that, that I fought so hard for it to be
No, I
considered?
thank you. Thank you for fighting for that's so cool of you. I this is such like a lame answer, and especially like to you who are clearly so like, educated and academic about all of this. And kind of like approaching it from such an erudite perspective. To me, genre is something that I'm just like, it feels so subjective. Like it's like it's not helpful to you my answer, but like I am
Right.
just writing a book and hoping the right readers find it and hoping it means something to someone in the world. And like, I it was signing with a horror publisher was definitely like a choice on our part, but I love the horror community. I think they've been incredibly welcoming and amazing, and I think there's so much to celebrate in horror. I think there's also so much to celebrate in sci-fi, fantasy, and science fiction was really what I grew up reading. So all those guys, like I read, I don't know, like Heinlein, and I love like the Forever War, and those kind of books. But so I'm down with that. I'm super cool with whatever categorization somebody wants to give it, as long as it, if it gets it to readers who might like enjoy it, then I am like the happiest girl in the world.
um, just on a side note, have you ever read C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore? Are you
No.
familiar? All right, now I'm going to give you an assignment. There's a whole book of just her letters to H.P. Lovecraft. She was in the Lovecraft circle in the 1930s, and she wrote one of the best vampire stories, her first short story sale to Weird Tales. It's called Shambleau. It's a Medusa vampire story set on Mars, from the 1930s. And
Gold. Thank
yeah,
you.
um, check out Catherine Lucille Moore. She's one of my big projects because she's from Indiana, my home state. And so one of the things I'm actually doing is the building she worked in is a Hilton Hotel now. And the mail slot where she sent all of her stories to Weird Tales still exists there. And I'm trying to get a plaque put in to
Wow.
honor her. So people who listen to my podcast for a long time are like, oh, here he goes again, telling people to read Salem Moore. But I want people to remember she was very popular science fiction and horror writer in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She was married to Henry Kuttner, who was also in the Lovecraft circle. They met because of Lovecraft, actually, which is very cool. But
That is so
anyways, let's get
cool.
into American Rapture, and this is your spoiler warning for. Well, before we do that, is there anything you want to promote? Put out there. I know you said you're towards the end of this tour promoting this book.
Yeah,
How
I'm,
can
I
find
mean,
you, all
like,
that stuff.
there are two books you can choose from at this point, but I of mine. But I've got more coming. So my next one comes out in spring 26th.
And what's the best way to follow you? Tour Nightfire website. Um,
Uh, I've got a website, cjleede.com. I'm not the best at updating it. And then my Instagram, Siege the Moment, CEEJ. That's like the easiest place to find me. But I am about to disappear for a little bit to finish my third book for the next couple months. So,
oh,
other
awesome.
than, yeah, I'm excited. So I'll pop on a couple times to announce some things. But otherwise, I'm kind of going dark for a little bit. And thank you for just like having me here and reading my books. And thanks to
Oh,
anyone
we're
who's
not
listening
done.
who's read. I know, no, no, I know, but thank you to anybody who's listening who's read them. I'm saying in case they sign off for the spoiler part.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you everybody for listening. If you're not listening to the spoiler section, do know that I have been neglecting my Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. We'll be coming back to that with Frederick Brown's Arena, which was turned into an episode of Star Trek, the original series. So I'm going to have my Star Trek Bridge crew on to talk about that story. So that'll be coming up soon. And then we're going to get back into our unproduced screenplay series. So on that note, we're now in spoilers. You've been warned. So we're going to get under the hood. I only have a couple of questions of things that I really wanted to know about. The chapter infection was a huge, this was a huge turning point. And this was like a brutal transition. If I'm remembering correctly, I did read this book about a month ago. So and I read a lot. So but this is the chapter where the parents where
Yeah.
Sophie has the kind of showdown with her parents. What this did, in my opinion, for the book, and this is the thing that I was going to be talking about, is the lust pandemic part of it. So we have the action here that this is a very horrifying scene, but what it's really doing is, I think, the lust pandemic kind of like hypersexualizes everyone, and by it being her parents and having them like in this situation, that's nobody wants to see their parents doing it, right? Right. So that's part of it. But for me, as a open-minded feminist husband who has a very radical feminist wife, I have seen how much I'm very aware of the hypersexualization of rape culture and it being out there and how hard it is for some women to be able to walk anywhere without being harassed. And what I thought was brilliant about the lust pandemic, and I had a reaction where I was sitting in my chair reading this book, and I looked at my wife, Carrie, and I said, huh, this is incredible. And she was like, what? And I said, this book is absolutely turning an apocalypse story out of rape culture and the whole like fear that women experience not being able to walk anywhere. It's that's what this book is about. That's 100% what this book is about,
Yeah.
in my opinion. And I don't know if I felt that way fully all the way through. And I know there's other things that are going on, but that's what hit me in that moment. And that was the thing that I thought was where I was like, wow, this is brilliant. This is genius. This is a, and it's one of the reasons why it puts it over Mave Fly for me, because I just thought that reveal or that thing or that feeling that I had reading it and seeing that expressed was just a genius work of science fiction, in my opinion.
Thank you. I mean, I do think it is like such a fact of reality, right? It's like I've been scared my whole life, of being out alone or like things that could possibly happen. And obviously I'm just one of like millions and millions of people who experience that. And I think that fear, and then additionally not arming young people with knowledge and information, and even more than that, this purity culture and this supercharged purity culture meets like very sex obsessed like capitalism, like that combination, I think, is a lot of what feeds into what can be so horrific about sexual dynamics. Is we kind of like tell young people, hey, this thing is all you're going to be thinking about, and it's like, but it's also this thing that you really can't talk about, and it's this shameful thing, and it's this
Mm,
dark thing, and like, it matters the most out of everything, but also like you cannot have it. And
yeah,
that is just like a freaking powder keg. Like that's
yeah.
it's such a pressure cooker of a situation. And I think like, I don't know. It's just
I'm
we
just
need to
so
get our shit
impressed that you
together.
were able to weave this into the weird apocalypse. I just thought it was genius and perfect, and that's you know
Thank you. Well, I started the book just wanting to say that though. I mean, that was the whole point. I did medieval studies in undergrad, so I was reading all this medieval and Renaissance literature, and we were doing Dante, and I was thinking about, his second circle of hell, and I just thought, this is America, like this
Mhm.
is us. Like this is like we're all just kind of spinning in this whirlwind we've created, and why? And do we need to be here? And is there anything wrong with us for being like human animals? Or, is there a way to approach this better where people would be safer? And like, I don't know.
Well, and here's one thing where I'm gonna bite a little bit off of the apple that from your interview with Neil McRobert, because I know that I the interesting relationship between Sophie and the cop who's named Marrow, right? Who's
Yeah.
young, and I know from that interview that you even wanted to make him younger or older.
Well,
Excuse me.
just he was originally older. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me because within the framework of that, he's a very likable character in the situation. He's doing all the right things, but it's his him being around Sophie is very nerve wracking. It's very just because for those of us who worry about these things, and if he had been older, it would have been 100 times worse. It's such an interesting choice, and I just found that aspect that their relationship to be very interesting part of the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think he was originally older because I was, you know, a young girl at one point, and like when I was a young person, like I had crushes on, like adults, right? Like you do. Like
Yeah,
teens have crushes on adults. And that nothing should come from that. But like it also like you have those crushes. You have the crushes on whatever, like celebrities. And I think so that's why when I first started writing it, again, I wrote this very young or started it very young. And I think at that time there were a lot of reasons it didn't get out into the world, and a lot of ways I needed to mature to understand how to write it. But also, I always wanted it to be that question of like, is this going to be not good? Because that's what this is. Like it, being like a young person trying to understand yourself in this kind of like like tumult, is that feeling of like every interaction is like, is this something I want? Is this safe? Is this okay? Is it not okay? And this is an apocalypse. And they're like, whatever, six
yeah.
years apart, he thinks they're 5 years apart or whatever. uh but it's, I don't know.
Well, and
Maybe
what
I
I
am
think
out
is
here trying to be subversive and I didn't realize it.
right. Well, and the interesting thing about it is that what I really liked about it is that it's not plain safe, right? You know, it's characters in real life are messy, and there's a lot of real messy situations that real life people get into. So
Yeah,
that's
and ultimately, like, obviously, I should say I never wanted to champion, like, any kind of, like, unsafe or damaging relationship. It was more just to say, yeah, like, humanity and sexuality are messy, and how do we, like, ultimately, Morrow, I thought was, like, an admirable character, because a 24-year-old, you're a freaking kid. Like, you don't know anything at 24, and, he didn't do anything weird, and, he
no, he
just,
didn't, and I want
you
to be
know
clear about that. But
yeah.
anybody listening should have read the book by now. So they know that. And but I think his role as Sophie's protector, in many ways makes him very endearing, but Sophie is interesting because she has two protectors. She has the dog as well, Bargarest, who's a great dog character. As a dog person, I enjoyed that. Why Wisconsin? I don't know if this had to be in spoilers, but you grew up in Texas, so it would seem like Texas would be a fertile place for this. As a Midwesterner, I was wondering why Wisconsin.
So I am like always on the road for a lot of years now, and I've been to all the states. I've slept on the side of the highway a lot and like in motels all over. Like I've kind of like seen as much of this country as I've been able to see, and I keep always trying to see more.
Hmm.
Um and I feel really passionate about wanting to like I love this place, and I know it's a crazy day to say that right now, but I
Yeah.
think there is a lot to love here, and I'm really trying to hold on to that these days. And especially, I think our back roads, our roadside attractions, our trails and parks and dive bars, like these are special and unique and American. And I feel very, very in love with them, and very much like I want to kind of go place by place and highlight what I think is special in this country as I write. And so each book is set in a different state,
Yeah.
so far at least. So Wisconsin was because it was one of the first places I started spending time in my late teens, early 20s that really I thought, wow, there's something unique here. Like there there's just such a kind of like specific cultural identity. I love Wisconsin people. I think it's a very welcoming place. Um
It's
and
interesting. I have two very good friends who grew up in Fond du Lac, and
yeah.
so I'm very aware of what you're saying because Wisconsin people have very interesting personalities,
Yeah, it's
especially
special. It's unique. And
yeah,
I knew I didn't want it to be Texas because it was like I didn't want this story to be me saying, "Hey, this is my life." Like I didn't grow up sheltered like Sophie. I don't have a brother. Um but also Texas is so kind of supercharged for me. Like that's going to be I
you'll
almost say
probably express it at some point, right?
I will. I gotta take a little time on Texas. But yeah, it's just a complicated place for me. So,
Gotcha.
Wisconsin was a place that I thought could kind of like I wanted any middle state because I like the middle of this country a lot, and I'm sick of hearing coastal people say the term flyover states. And I picked one that really spoke to me, but I'm kind of my next book's Colorado, so I'm just working my way through.
Gotcha. Well, I grew up in Indiana, and so I write a lot of Indiana too. So
I love that.
yeah, well, one of the things about Wisconsin people I noticed too is like my friends from Wisconsin, they're really good at non-verbal communication, or they'll sometimes only say parts of sentences and then they'll nod at each other like they know what the hell they're saying, which I've always thought was really interesting about Wisconsiners. But yeah, they're interesting lot. So you know, once the story kind of starts unspooling, the danger and all those things that that come with all of it, the social, like I said, the social science fiction of it all is the thing that is really interesting to me. But the arc for Sophie, um, you know, is also just a very powerful part of it, and it's one of the things that makes it character based. Like, what was the journey that you set aside for Sophie, or did you know ahead of time, or was that a discovery thing? Because I'm an outliner personally, but I don't know if you're a pantser or an outliner, but you
Uh,
know,
Yeah, I always knew, like, I always know my endings, but like I always know kind of the last like 2 to 5 pages. But
mm,
usually anything leading up to that is like really subject to change. But I like to have my endings in mind, like when I start a book. And I always knew this is crazy. This is my first spoiler. Like this is the first one where I can just talk about the ending.
yeah,
Um, I think I always knew she was gonna like free herself of these ideas, at least a little bit, at least for a moment, and feel that freedom and lean into it. And I think I always kind of knew she wasn't going to find her brother because it, I don't know that it was ever about
I
that. It
love
was,
that choice, by the way.
thank you. I had to
Yeah,
kind of fight for that actually at different times, or really kind of, we tried hard to justify it. But it's like this is just to go with the metaphor, it's like it's a very personal journey. It's like you don't need a family member really to tell you these things. Like you have to
yeah.
figure it out on your own. So that was really what the book was about for her.
Well, and okay, so I got two more questions, and I'll let we can start wrapping up about the spoilers, because yes, now you have this opportunity to talk about it. You
No,
haven't,
it's crazy.
yeah. So here, and I asked Brian this question the other day too, which is, so on this journey of writing this book, and this always happens in writing a book for all of us when we write something this long, there's sometimes moments that there's a lot of moments that feel great when you get there. Like, what's the moment where, oh, I finally get to write this scene. But there's also moments that are just pure discovery where you're like, I don't know that anyone else is going to catch this or care about this. But are there any moments in American Rapture where you're like, I don't know if anyone else is going to notice this, but this to me is a key or a linchpin to this story. It's something that, um, fans of the book who've already read it can go back and look for, or
I
maybe
think
keep.
um there were little things like it's actually kind of a cheesy line, but to me it was very personal. When I grew up, we had a lot of mourning doves around all the time. And I thought it was the worst, loneliest sound. Like that sound to me is just being alone as a kid and not wanting to be. And so um that there's like one line at the end when they've come out of the fire and they're at the gas station, and I think it's something like, like the mourning dove calls above and she says it's the worst sound I've ever heard. And it's actually kind of a cheesy line where it is, but
Yeah.
it really, to me, it was like that is like the feeling. But
Oh,
there's a
that's
scene.
a great example of what I was looking for.
Okay, good. But there
Brian
is,
just said, I don't know. So let's give him a
I
hard
could have
time.
said I don't know. I have more. I don't know, but I don't want to, like, we have to wrap up maybe.
No, no, no. What, go.
There is a scene that I think is like maybe the linchpin scene of the entire book that actually came in at the very end. And this is where I'm like, oh my God, I had to be a 32-year-old in order to write this and get it right. And it's the scene where Cleo is talking to Sophie in the hotel and saying, this is going to be with you your whole life, and you're never really going to escape it, but you will have moments. And that
Mhm.
whole exchange, that was not there until now, like until the very end, like
Yeah.
right before final edits and copy edits. So it was that to me felt like, okay, sometimes we really just can't finish the book till we're ready to.
Yeah. And are- and then lastly, now that we're in spoilers, are there is there any reaction to the book where that you found hilarious where you can't believe, oh, I didn't see that, or like, whoa, that person got it totally wrong, or anything like that?
I mean, the biggest thing is like people just being like so mad about Barghest.
Right.
Which like I get it because it's horrible. It was like horrible to write, but it's also like I was saying something and also it's fiction. But one reviewer, and this is when I stopped reading the reviews on this book, but one of them did say, uh, I must be mentally ill and should not be allowed to like have animals if I could do that to an animal in my book. And I remember that one actually really bothered me because obviously when you're like an animal lover, you're like, oh my God, am I not fit to be an animal person?
Oh,
Uh,
come on. That's somebody who
but
doesn't understand what writing is about. Yeah,
I
and
guess
they,
that's
I
what it
think,
is.
yeah, and they don't understand how much we are tortured by these things, you know.
Yeah, or the fear of something happening to your dogs who are like your whole life, and thinking like
Yeah.
they tell you like writing is, writing in horror, it's like what's the worst thing that can happen in this moment? It's like that is the worst thing to me.
Well,
There's
and they've
nothing worse.
obviously never read I Am Legend because, like, the greatest dog heartbreak of all time. Um, and you know, actually what the only time I've ever been starstruck in my career was meeting Richard Matheson, and
That makes sense.
well, and he told a story to me when I met him that he wrote I Am Legend for a novel writing class at UCLA in 1954, and that um, he was turning in chapters of I Am Legend like as they were going, like as everyone was in the class, and that the professor made him read that whole chapter with the dog um, to the class. And he said everyone was like weeping, and that the teacher pointed at him and said, "That's a writer, folks. He's going places." And of course, he had
Wow.
already published at that point, but um, it's still an amazing story. And whoever that reviewer was doesn't get like you're going for heartbreak, right? We know this. We know this.
Yeah, and just, the fact that like life is so hard and we don't need to make it harder, with like dumb stuff. Like we just got to hug our loved ones and our animals and, hold on tight.
So that being said, CJ, this was a great discussion. I love this book. I think it's
Thank you.
fantastic. I haven't done my top 10 of the year, but I have a pretty good, this has been a good year. But I think it's going to make it. And I think for the reason that we talked about early in the spoilers. I mean, you did bring up that issue before we got to spoilers in a more articulate way without giving away. But
Yeah, I've done this a few times now. But
yeah,
thank you. And thanks for your really thoughtful read and questions.
well, is there this is you're about to end this tour for this book, you're about to go dark. Is there any last in spoilers like thing you want to get off your chest on this book, or
Um, what I'll say is not a lot of people asked about the tornado, but when I was a kid, I did like outrun a tornado in my mom's like two-seater soft top convertible with like no working, it's like a vintage, like some old car, and the funnel was behind us, like coming from Oklahoma to Texas. So if you ever meet me and want to talk tornado stories, I will talk about tornadoes.
I
There
have
you go.
one. My I was at my grandparents' house in Albert Lee, Minnesota, southern Minnesota, and I was very young, and a tornado came 2 blocks away from their house, and I could not take my eyes off it in the window. And it's that my grandmother was very calm. The only time she ever swore at me, she said, "Get your ass down," and grabbed me by my ear and pulled me away from the
Good
window.
grandma.
It was the only time I ever heard my grandma swear in my entire life was when I was an idiot sticking my face in the window watching the tornado. So I understand. I could not take my eyes off of it.
Yeah, they're mesmerizing and terrifying.
Yeah, so we'll have to talk tornadoes. CJ Leede, author of Mave Fly and American Rapture. Thank you for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World. Again, folks, Science Fiction Hall of Fame series will be coming back, episode 10 of the series. And we're still in the 1940s, so we got a way to go. But I appreciate everyone listening, and please check out if I because if you listen this far, you've read American Rapture. But if you haven't read Mave Fly, get that too. And thank you for joining us.